They sold the house that kept my secrets, and with it, every memory that ever made us a family. It started with an email from a realtor I didn't know. "Congratulations," it read. "The Bennett property on Maple Lane has sold." No warning, no goodbye, just a transaction, the kind that costs more than money. I stared at the photos attached, the white shutters repainted gray, my mother's rose garden uprooted, the porch swing gone. The caption read, "Fully remodeled, ready for a new chapter." For them, maybe it was a new chapter. For me, it was an obituary. My name is Laura Bennett, 36, a real estate developer in Boston. I've restored dozens of houses for strangers, but I could never fix the one that built me. That house wasn't perfect. The pipes rattled, the roof leaked every March, but it held the sound of my childhood laughter, my grandfather's humming from the tool shed, and the promise he whispered before he died. "Keep this place in the family, Laura. It's where our roots live." That was the year my father started seeing everything as an asset instead of a memory. When money got tight, love became negotiable. So yes, I understand business, but some things shouldn't be sold. If you've ever watched a piece of your past get priced, polished, and handed to strangers, you'll understand. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of your childhood you still hold on to. And if stories like this remind you that value isn't measured in dollars, subscribe so we can keep these memories alive together. I drove back that night, parking across the street like a stranger. The porch light glowed, but not for me. The laughter inside wasn't ours. The windows reflected my face and the ghost of a little girl who once believed her family would never change. They hadn't just sold a house. They'd sold the last place that still knew my name. But fate, as it turns out, keeps strange receipts, because 3 months later, a different email arrived, one with a property list from the bank. At the top, 412M, the same house. Only this time, I was the buyer. The last time I felt at peace in that house, I was 10 years old. Grandpa had just finished building the porch swing, and I remember sitting beside him, my legs too short to touch the ground. The smell of sawdust, the late summer breeze, the sound of his slow humming, it all felt eternal. "This house will always be yours, Laura," he'd said, patting my hand. "Family isn't about who pays the bills. It's about who keeps the light on." That was before money changed everything. After Grandpa passed, the laughter faded first. Then came the silences, the kind that fill a home even when no one's talking. My father, once the man who spent weekends fixing leaky faucets, began locking himself in the study, crunching numbers that never added up. Mom started hosting dinners for people she used to whisper about, calling them business partners. I'd listen from the staircase, hearing her laugh, sharp, brittle, rehearsed. "It's an investment," she'd say. "Everything is, if you look at it right." That word, investment, became their new faith. And slowly, the house turned from a home into an asset. I remember finding the key box in Grandpa's old drawer one afternoon, a small brass container shaped like a heart with a single word carved underneath. Keep. Inside was a note in his shaky handwriting, "For Laura, when the house is truly hers." I never told my parents about it. Somehow, I knew they'd never understand something so sentimental. Years passed, and the more I succeeded in my own life, the more distant they grew. When I started my design firm at 28, my father said, "Cute hobby." When I bought my first property, my mother said, "You finally learned something from us." But behind every cutting remark, I could still see the people they used to be, the ones who held hands at the breakfast table and danced barefoot in the kitchen when the radio played Sinatra. I missed them, not the people they became. The breaking point came 2 years ago at Thanksgiving. I brought a framed photo of Grandpa to the dinner table, a way to honor him. My father looked at it and said, "We should sell the old place before winter. The taxes are ridiculous." I thought he was joking, but when he mentioned a buyer's name, someone from his golf club, I realized he'd already made up his mind. I remember the fork falling from my hand, the quiet clatter echoing louder than any argument. "You can't sell it, Dad," I whispered. "Grandpa left it for us." "For me, he left it to me, Laura," he said flatly. "And I can do whatever I want with my property." That was the moment I understood what family legacy meant to them. It wasn't about love, or memory, or even respect. It was about ownership. They sold the house 6 months later, quietly, efficiently, without a single word. And the day I found out, I opened Grandpa's brass key box again. The note inside had yellowed, but the ink was still steady, like his voice. "For Laura, when the house is truly hers." At the time, I didn't know what it meant, but I would soon. Because sometimes life finds a way to honor promises long after the people who made them are gone. And the next email that landed in my inbox, listing that same address, now foreclosed, wasn't a coincidence. It was a calling. 3 months after that Thanksgiving, I opened my laptop one evening, reviewing potential properties for renovation. It was just another night, until I saw an address I knew by heart, 412 Maple Lane. At first, I thought it was a cruel coincidence, but there it was. The same porch, the same swing hooks still rusting under the eaves, now empty. The listing said, "Foreclosure pending. Significant water damage. Sold as is." The house my parents had sold for profit was crumbling. I stared at the photo, zooming in until the pixels blurred. The shutters hung uneven. The rose garden was gone. The maple tree, once golden with autumn light, now stood bare and gray, like it had been waiting. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was fate, but I knew then I was going to buy it. I contacted the bank the next morning. My company's finances were healthy. We'd closed 3 major projects that year. It wasn't even a difficult purchase, just a strangely poetic one. The man handling the sale, an older agent named Mr. Caldwell, leaned forward after reviewing my ID. "You're a Bennett, huh? Any relation to Robert and Helen Bennett?" "Their daughter," I said evenly. "Well," he sighed, tapping the file, "guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree, though in your case maybe it rolled uphill." I smiled politely. Inside, my chest burned. A week later, I stood at the threshold again. The same wooden door, the same iron handle. Only this time I turned the key. My key. The smell hit first, damp plaster and dust, mixed with something faintly familiar, the echo of old lavender polish my mother used every Saturday morning. I walked through each room like tracing ghosts. The kitchen tiles were cracked, the wallpaper peeled, but I could still see Grandpa standing by the sink, whistling. And then, in the attic, I found it. The ledger box, a small wooden chest, tucked behind insulation, its brass latch rusted but still intact. I carried it downstairs, heart racing. Inside were old deeds, receipts, and one thin envelope marked in my grandfather's handwriting, "To be opened by my heir, not my executors." The ink had faded, but the message was clear. The envelope had never been opened. When I did, my hands trembled. Inside was a letter and a copy of his will, written 5 years before his death. He had left the house to me, not to my father, not to the Bennett estate, but directly, by name, to my granddaughter, Laura Bennett, who understands the soul of this home. But that wasn't the shocking part. At the bottom, in careful legal print, it read, "This clause shall remain valid unless amended with Laura Bennett's consent in writing." There was no amendment. No signature, which meant my parents had sold property that never legally belonged to them. The betrayal wasn't just emotional now, it was deliberate. I sat there for hours, surrounded by dust and silence, the light from the window falling across the brass key box I'd brought with me. Grandpa's note, "For Laura, when the house is truly hers," suddenly made sense. He must have known they'd try to take it. He must have planned for this. The next morning, I met with my attorney, Rachel Pierce, a sharp woman with the calm confidence of someone who's seen too many family betrayals. "They sold it illegally," she confirmed, scanning the papers. "The will was never transferred. It's yours by direct inheritance. So what happens now? You can keep it quietly. Or you can reclaim it publicly quietly," I said. "For now." Because deep down, I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I wanted to see what karma looked like when it wore a familiar face. That night, I walked around the house with a flashlight. The floors creaked, the windows moaned with wind. But in that stillness, I felt something sacred. The house remembering me. In the corner of the living room, I found one of Mom's old ceramic vases, cracked but whole. Inside it, hidden beneath dust, was a single photo. My parents, holding me as a baby on the porch swing, Grandpa standing proudly behind us. Someone had written on the back, "Home is who we are together." I stared at it for a long time, because now we weren't together. And maybe that was the truest thing about all of this. I placed the photo back in the vase, left it on the mantel, and whispered into the emptiness, "I'm home, Grandpa." The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, my phone buzzed. An email from a rental inquiry system. It was from Helen Bennett. "We're looking for a short-term lease near Maple Lane. The house looks familiar. Is it available?" I read it twice. Then I smiled quietly. The story was coming full circle. They had sold the house that raised me, and now they were about to rent it from their own daughter. I didn't answer the email right away. I read it 3 times, each word sharper than the last. "We're looking for a short-term lease near Maple Lane. The house looks familiar. Is it available?" It was signed Helen Bennett, my mother. I stared at the screen for so long that the cursor blinked like a pulse. The irony was so complete it almost felt scripted. They'd sold the house that raised me, and now life had quietly delivered them back to its doorstep. I replied with a simple professional tone, "The property is available. 6-month lease, utilities included. Background check required, no signature, no hint of who I was, just landlord." A week later, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. I watched from the upstairs window, unseen. My father stepped out first, looking older, smaller than I remembered. The woman behind him, my mother, still wore the same pearls, but her voice had lost its sharpness when she said, "It's smaller than I remember." They walked through the yard like tourists in a museum of their own mistakes. When they reached the porch, my heart pounded against my ribs. The last time I'd stood there, I was begging them not to sell. Now I was waiting for them to sign. The knock came soft, hesitant. I opened the door with a calmness I didn't feel. "You must be Mrs. Whitman," my father said, mistaking my alias. "The listing said the owner doesn't live here?" "That's correct," I replied, steady. "I manage it for her." He nodded, scanning the living room. My mother brushed her hand along the banister, the same one Grandpa had carved initials into. "It's familiar," she whispered. Familiar. The word hurt more than I expected. I showed them around, the newly painted walls, the restored floors, the small photo of Grandpa I'd left intentionally on the mantel. My mother's eyes lingered on it, confusion flickering for a moment. "He looks so much like your grandfather," she murmured. "Maybe because it was his house?" I said softly, half smile in place. She didn't catch it. By the time the tour ended, they looked exhausted. Or haunted. "We'll take it," my father said. 6 months, as listed. When they signed the lease, I noticed my father's hands trembling slightly. I wondered if he realized the cruel poetry of it, that the daughter he'd dismissed now owned the walls that once held their laughter. That night, after they left, I stood in the same kitchen where I'd once begged for their love and whispered, "Welcome home." They moved in 2 weeks later. From that day on, I watched from a quiet distance. Their car parked crooked in the driveway, lights turning on at odd hours. It was like the house itself was rejecting them. The first storm hit in early November. Rain lashed against the windows, and I got a message from my property manager. "Tenants requesting help. Leak in attic." I went myself. When I arrived, my father was at the door, holding a flashlight. He looked startled to see me. "You came yourself," he said. "That's unusual for landlords." "Some houses deserve a personal touch," I replied. The power flickered, thunder rumbling above. I climbed into the attic, the same space where I'd found Grandpa's letter, and saw water seeping through the ceiling. I patched what I could, then heard footsteps behind me. My mother stood there, eyes damp. "It's strange being back," she said quietly. "I keep expecting Laura to walk down the stairs with her sketchbook." "Do you?" I asked, voice low. "Yes," she whispered. "She had such a good heart. We just didn't know how to handle her." For a moment I almost answered, almost said, "She's right here." But I didn't. I let silence hold the weight instead. Before leaving, I handed them a copy of the emergency contact sheet, the header bold, property owner, Laura Bennett. My father read it aloud, confused. "Laura Bennett?" "Yes," I said evenly, watching his eyes widen. The color drained from his face. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "You own this house?" "No," I corrected gently. "I inherited it." Grandpa made sure of that. The room went still, except for the soft sound of rain. "You tricked us," my father said, voice trembling. "No," I said. "You tricked yourselves. 20 years ago, when you sold what was never yours to sell." My mother began to cry, not loudly, but in the quiet, collapsing way of someone who realizes too late what they've broken. "We didn't know," she said. "You didn't want to know," I answered. "And that's worse." Thunder cracked again, shaking the rafters. "So, what now?" my father asked, defeated. "You stay," I said, "as tenants. Because even after everything, this house deserves someone who remembers it." I turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "But know this, you'll pay for every month you took love for granted." And as I stepped out into the storm, lightning illuminated the brass key in my hand, the one Grandpa left me. It gleamed like justice. The storm that night didn't just flood the roof, it broke something deeper. For days after, my parents avoided me, tiptoeing through the house as if it could hear their guilt. But the walls of Maple Lane always listened. They'd soaked up too many secrets to stay silent forever. One afternoon, I returned to check the repairs. My father was in the study, the same room Grandpa used to read his newspapers in, but now the air felt different, heavier. On the desk lay an open folder I didn't remember leaving behind. Inside were copies of legal papers, yellowed and creased. My mother froze when she saw me. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. I stepped closer. The papers were from the year Grandpa died. Property documents, an addendum to the will, and a notarized statement with 2 signatures, Robert and Helen Bennett. It was dated 1 month after his funeral. The letter on top made my hands go cold. It was from Grandpa's attorney confirming the change of ownership as requested by Robert Bennett. A forged request. "You forged it," I said quietly. My father looked up, eyes hollow. "We didn't forge anything. We corrected a mistake. Your grandfather was old. He meant to leave it to the family. He did," I said. "To me. You just couldn't stand that his trust in me was greater than yours in money." My mother broke first. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "We were drowning, Laura. The business was collapsing, and your father thought, if we could sell the house, maybe we could start again." "At the cost of your daughter's inheritance?" "At the cost of everything," she whispered. Her honesty hit harder than any lie ever did. My father slammed his palm on the table. "Don't turn this into some moral lesson. We did what we had to. The past doesn't pay bills." "No," I said, "but it does collect interest." I reached into my coat pocket and placed Grandpa's original letter, the one I'd found in the attic, beside their papers. "He knew," I said softly. "He knew you'd do this. That's why he hid the real will. He trusted the house to find its way back to me." My father stared at the familiar handwriting, his lips trembling. My mother reached out but didn't touch it. For a long time, none of us spoke. The rain outside softened into a whisper, tapping against the window like a metronome of regret. "We thought you'd never forgive us," she said finally. "You were right," I replied. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you prove." I turned to leave, but she caught my wrist, frail, trembling. "Then let us prove it," she said. "Let us stay. Let us make it right." Something inside me twisted. Part of me wanted to shout, to throw them out into the storm the way they'd once thrown out love itself. But another part, the one that still remembered her mother singing in the kitchen, her father lifting her onto the porch swing, couldn't. "You can stay," I said at last, "but not as my parents." As tenants who understand the price of what they took, her tears fell freely now. My father said nothing, just nodded, once, as if accepting a verdict he'd known was coming for years. I left them in that silence, the kind that rebuilds walls from the inside. Outside, the maple tree swayed gently in the wind, leaves brushing the window pane like forgiveness knocking softly. I walked to the trunk and pressed my hand against the initials Grandpa carved, L+WB. The bark had grown around the letters, healing but never erasing them. "You kept your promise, Grandpa," I whispered. "The house is home again." That night, I drafted a letter to my lawyer. The Bennett property is to be held under the Bennett Heritage Foundation, dedicated to restoring family homes for single mothers and veterans. No profits, only preservation, because some legacies aren't meant to be owned, they're meant to be passed forward. Before sealing the envelope, I added one final line, just for myself. Let them stay long enough to remember what love once sounded like in these walls. As I turned off the lights and stepped outside, the porch swing creaked softly in the wind, like the house was breathing again. The story that began with betrayal was finally learning the sound of peace. Winter came early that year. By December, the maple tree outside had shed all its leaves, leaving only its sturdy trunk, quiet, scarred, but still standing. Sometimes I'd stand on the porch at dusk, coffee in hand, watching the light fall across the house that had witnessed every version of me. The child, the outcast, and finally, the woman who came home on her own terms. Inside, my parents had changed in small, almost invisible ways. My mother started baking again. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the hall just like it used to. My father fixed the porch railing without being asked, humming the same tune Grandpa once did. They didn't apologize every day, but their gestures spoke louder than any words could. And me? I stopped needing revenge. I'd already won, because I'd rebuilt what they'd tried to sell, not just a house, but the meaning of family. One evening, my mother left a note on the kitchen counter. "We found something in the attic. It's yours." It was the old photo, the one of us on the porch swing, Grandpa standing behind. On the back, she'd written, "Thank you for bringing us home." For the first time in years, I smiled without bitterness. Maybe forgiveness doesn't erase what was broken, but it gives you the strength to live with the cracks. When I walk through those rooms now, the air feels different. The walls no longer echo with anger. They hum with peace. The house doesn't belong to any of us anymore. It belongs to the love that survived everything we did to destroy it. They sold my childhood home, I whisper sometimes to the empty rooms, but I rebuilt it, one truth at a time. If you've ever lost something that once felt like home, let this be your reminder. Sometimes the place you're meant to return to isn't a building, it's yourself. And if this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you forgive or walk away? If you believe some wounds can still grow flowers, like and subscribe, not for me, but for every soul who's learning to rebuild brick by brick with dignity. Because the truest homes aren't inherited, they're earned, and the people who once shut you out might one day knock again. But this time, you'll be the one holding the key.